For more, joining us live is Simon Jackman, the CEO of the US Studies Centre. Simon, appreciate your time. As we saw in that report from Annalise, tributes pouring in from all sides of policies. What legacy do you see Colin Powell leaving behind?
Oh, look, one of, I think, decency, number one, and as a pathbreaker, trailblazer. This is a remarkable American life that has ended. 2 combat tours of Vietnam, 1962 and 1968, entering the military in the 50s, and imagine what that's like for a young man of colour to be entering a dominantly white institution, the Officer Corps of the US Army, finding his way and then becoming the youngest general officer at the time in the US Army, being promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He leapfrogged 14 other more senior candidates for that position when he's promoted to that position. And then putting his stamp. Today, we still talk about the Powell Doctrine. It's a doctrine about when and how the US uses force that bears his name and is informed directly by a young officer's experience in Vietnam. And the 2 rules are that the US, as a superpower, goes in with overwhelming force and with a clear exit strategy. And indeed, the integrity of the man, I think, comes into play and comes into contrast when his reflections on did he live up to his own doctrine in prosecuting the case for the invasion of Iraq when he was Secretary of State. Loyal servant to the administration that he was, but nonetheless, for the rest of his life, I think that moment of great inner conflict that surrounded, in particular, the high watermark being his speech to the United Nations General Assembly, making the case as best as he could, whereas I think inside he is making a case that and leading the US down a pathway that is at odds with the doctrine he so expertly espoused and so expertly executed in the 1989 invasion of Panama and in the 1991 Operation Desert Storm.
Yeah, remarkable life, no doubt about that. Simon, while I've got you, I do want to turn to current issues as well. I'm keen for your take in particular on the climate debate we're seeing here in Australia and the parallels with what's going on in the US. How is Joe Biden tracking in terms of actually following through on what are very ambitious climate plans?
Well, it's so fascinating, right? The parallels between what's happening and the politics around climate in the 2 countries right now. Joe Biden's got the following problem. His base wants an incredibly ambitious climate agenda to be implemented in law, to come through the Congress. His problem is that he's only got 50 Democratic votes in the US Senate, with the vice president being the tie-breaking vote. He loses any one of those 50 votes and the package goes down. And right now, it's Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, the most conservative Democrat in his caucus there, that is saying, I can't, as a senator from West Virginia, support the $150 billion renewable energy package that sits at the heart of Biden's climate agenda, at least insofar as it's got to go through Congress. It looks right now that part of the package has to come out. And that is just how diabolical and delicately diabolical the politics of climate are in the United States right now. And frankly, not unlike the political situation we see in Australia, where, again, managing a broad coalition required for government sees inevitably some really hard choices and compromises being made when it comes to an issue like climate. How do you sort of move the policy needle on that while nonetheless keeping coalitions together? Joe Biden's managing that right now and is probably going to see policy action on climate slow right down as a consequence. But again, the parallels and resonances with Australian political life at the moment, striking and too good for the US Studies Centre not to be paying attention to.
So Simon, just finally, when it comes to the pressure on Australia from the US to take further action on climate change, how is that pressure being exerted and how strenuous is that pressure?
Look, occasionally it does percolate above the fold. You will see occasionally, say, the climate envoy, former Secretary of State John Kerry, explicitly referencing the fact that Australia didn't do as much as it could, say, at previous international climate conferences, the Madrid round, perhaps in particular. But seldom, I don't think you're ever going to see Joe Biden call out, say, Scott Morrison or leader to leader public. I think there's a lot going on behind closed doors. I think the other factor here that is the far bigger driver, I think, in all of this, and one we don't pay enough attention to, I think, is just what's happening on the ground. Forget Canberra, forget Washington. It's the choices being made by households, by businesses, by research companies and universities, the amount of R&D and commercial activity that's proceeding nonetheless in both countries. I think that's true. And if anything, that's the way. That's one of the ways that Australia and the rest of the world, for that matter, is following America's lead to some example. Once the private sector in America gets unleashed on this, then you'll start to see, just for commercial reasons and due diligence and all good commercial prudence reasons, plus public opinion, it's those drivers more so than, say, any phone call Biden might make to Morrison or anything that John Kerry might say in an interview. It's those drivers, I think, are perhaps far more significant, not just in the long term, but in the short term as well. I think in Australia, perhaps playing some catch-up ball on this issue.
Simon Jackman, always good to chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.